Well, we have made it all the way to the E of Thrive, and I imagine that you're feeling kind of full in a lot of ways. Yeah, so maybe just take a couple deep breaths. Just get that breath down into the belly, expand through the ribs. Just kind of use the breath to enliven yourself so that we can finish strong. One of the things I say oftentimes when I'm teaching mindfulness is when we get about 90% of the way through everything, we start being on to the next thing, right? So we're like, oh, I'm gonna drive home and I gotta stop and pick up the groceries and I'm gonna, right? And you know, there's really, what I like to say, nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, just this breath. Yeah, it's a really good mantra to keep us present and just know that whatever needs to happen after this, right? It's Friday night. You may have a really great margarita waiting for you. It will wait, right? Thinking about it now will not make it more or less enjoyable later. And so even though we know we're like right coming around the corner to the finish line, let's just make an effort to stay present and remind ourselves that there's nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, just this breath, yeah? So we're gonna finish with enrichment, and I want the takeaway for enrichment to be, we are not adding more to your already overloaded and busy professional lives. We want this to be an effortless way for you to add things into your life and the lives that you touch that just feels organic and feels natural. Enriching, shall we say. Could we use that word for this? It's very enriching. One of the easiest ways I like to distinguish enrichment from some of the other things as we do is to look at the difference in definitions between sports and recreation, right? So sports are very performance related. Getting ready to perform a sport is very strategic. You do certain things to obtain certain outcomes, just much like you do in the classroom or in education. Whereas recreation, by definition, is something that we do for leisure or enjoyment. Okay, kind of the difference between enrichment and curriculum, yeah? Yeah, so we have a curriculum, we have outcomes, we have to do things, but enrichment is just simply a way to create things that are enriching, but don't have a specific outcome per se. Does that make sense? Yeah, so sports, recreation, think of this as the recreation of education, that part of it. Okay, so this is designed to sort of support that whole person, to make sure that what we're doing is getting to the idea of whole person care, and we're not just looking at how we can be an educator, how we can have better test scores, what can we do. And really when we look at all the things we've talked about today in the Thrive program, that's really everything we've talked about, right? Like everything is about how can we have whole person care and whole person attention. So we're looking at being self-actualized, wholeness, transcendence. So if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's where we get this idea of being self-actualized, but it all comes from a foundation of just the basic needs and basic necessities, and then we build from there. And much like when I talked about the model of change, where we can have relapse and we enter from a lot of different ways, the trans-theoretical model of change, or what we call self-actualization, is another thing where we can be really great at working our way up that pyramid, and then something happens and we take a step or two back, and then we move back up, and then maybe we're back down. But having enrichment and enriching activities as part of that helps us keep moving up, and it also gives us some grounding. It gives us something to come back to. Is it a patience issue maybe? Okay, so if we look at enrichment activities and we put them into these 7 categories, and if you look over there and it says the healthy mind platter, and we're looking at sleep time, remember, and again, like some planned redundancy where that we're bringing some of these concepts again and again, because why? They're super important, right? So we don't just talk about it and say, good luck with that sleeping thing, but we're reiterating how important it is. I know, good luck with that. Some physical time to be physical with our bodies, to move our bodies, to keep them enlivened. When I think about the body, so my actual education is in exercise physiology. I think of the body as a cement mixer truck, right? So we all know what that looks like. We see the big truck and it's going down the road, and the tank on the truck is always turning, okay? So there's movement there, because in order for the cement not to turn to concrete, we have to have that movement. And once it turns to concrete, to break it up is a lot more work than to let it flow out the back of the cement mixer. And this is why we use our bodies. This is why the mind-body connection is so important, because we have to keep things moving through the system. Otherwise, it turns to concrete, and it's a lot harder to work with. Focus time, so things that are on task, okay? Time that is on task. Time in, and we'll talk about the difference between time in and time out so that you have a good understanding of that and how to best use it. Downtime, that we call that R&R, right? Rest and relax, or what I say is restore. Playtime and connecting time. So if we look at all of those as ways that add enrichment to our life, we could look at that and say, geez, like some of these things come really naturally for us. Some of these are already embedded in your life. So for example, when we talk about connecting time, and then also I think time in is another one, and maybe even playtime. So you may have groups of people, communities, or hobbies that create that connection. So maybe you belong to a running club, or maybe you have a church community, or maybe you have maybe you're part of 4-H or some other, Future Farmers of America, whatever organization. And so you're getting that connection, you're getting playtime, you're getting some of those other elements. And so these are the things that add value to our lives that can, again, whole person, self-actualized person. And then there's some of these things that may not come as naturally for us. But what we're trying to do in our classroom is to create opportunities for people to step into these. And I think that a lot of educators do this naturally. And it's part of what we learn as teachers. So if we look at focus time, when we take time on take on challenges and focus on tasks, we make deep connections in the brain. So give me some examples of focus time activities, just as an educator. Like, what would you call a focus time activity? Ideas? Solving a difficult math problem, okay? Yeah, so things that require us to attend to task, okay? It may be things like goal setting, share and teach, brain breaks. Am I right? Oh, okay, brain breaks didn't sound like time on task to me, or time.
Right, yeah, brain breaks is kind of a misnomer.
Okay.
Are you guys familiar with brain breaks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're not really giving your brain a break. It's kind of a misnomer, but you're engaging it in another way.
In another way.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Do one now?
What?
I said do a brain break right now.
Yes. Can we do a brain break right now? Because my brain is starting to break, I think.
Yeah. And you
Yeah.
guys are familiar with brain breaks, and we have some videos on it, on some great ones. But it's just a way that you can take the first minute or two when your kids come into the classroom, or you start, you hit that lunch slump that we did, or afternoon slump.
Afternoon slump.
Now. And so, for example, point your fingers, both your two pointer fingers, and then thumbs up. Point your fingers, thumbs up. I want you to start to rotate that. Finger, thumb, finger, thumb, finger, thumb, finger, thumb, finger, thumb. All right, let's go back. Fingers, thumbs, fingers, thumbs. Now rotate it.
Oh, you've got to be.
Right? Why is this so hard? So it's a way that just gets, so we call them brain breaks, but you're using your brain in another.
Did you get it?
No, right? Another can be, just wrap your arm around and touch your ear, right? And then switch it out and touch your ear and touch your ear. And then you just start doing that faster and faster, and it can be harder to, you're just getting people moving their body. There's some you can do really intentionally. You can do some with breath, right? You can have it and just have everyone put the thumbs together, and then the fingers, the middle fingers, the ring fingers, the pinkies, and then you rotate that, or reverse that and go back. So sometimes you want to use these to quiet people down, quiet the kids down, get back. Or then you can shake it up, right? Middle fingers together, pinkies, thumbs, and you start to rev it up, and they're touching that way. So it's just ways that they're engaging in a way that's fun. So you're not really giving your brain a break, but you're engaging it in a whole new way. And then don't you feel more alert?
Yeah. I do, actually. I have to. Thank you. I could use a little of that because apparently, yeah, the coffee's not readily available. So.
4 hours of sleep this morning.
Right. Yeah, I could have a whole conversation around lack of sleep right now. Okay. So downtime, so non-focused time with no specific goals allow our mind to wander, relax, and recharge. Yeah, so downtime is not scrolling Facebook and Instagram. It's actually, as in the definition, just allow the mind to wander. And what's interesting to me is this idea that downtime is an actual activity, like letting your mind wander is an actual activity that enhances the enrichment. And when I talk to people about meditating, they're like, I can't, my brain just won't shut down. Great, that's okay too, right? So you see, it's kind of in our perception of what should be happening. Then let your mind wander. Let that brain kind of go off and take itself for a walk. I equate it to kind of like when you get a puppy and you have a puppy on a leash, and the first time you put that puppy on the leash, you're like everywhere and it's going and you can't pull it back. And eventually the puppy kind of learns, right? Like where its space is on the leash, and eventually it can come and just sit by your side, right? So when we let our mind wander, it's great. And the more we let that happen, the calmer the mind gets, and the more it like flushes out the things that don't need to be thought of anymore, right? Yeah, so this idea. With downtime, okay? So things like mindfulness, free play, doodling, like these are all really great. Like remember I said, I don't consider myself necessarily artistic or somebody who can like free draw, but to sit down and like doodle sometimes is really relaxing, and it's just letting that mind go. Yeah, so you could do these things in the classroom. Mindfulness, there's a couple things with food around mindfulness and intentionally eating. So if you, we'll take a cup of coffee because I'm having a lot of coffee fantasies right now. So if I look at my cup of coffee and to just sort of have this idea of like downtime, to look at my cup of coffee and to trace it back to where it came from. So I say, okay, I'll start with the coffee, not the mug, right? So this water, these beans, where were they roasted? Somebody had to show up for work that day in order for my beans to be roasted. And then I go back further and say, well, somebody had to buy the beans for the roaster. Somebody had to grow the beans. Somebody had to like really be invested in their crops that year. Mother Nature was involved. Sunshine was involved. And to just really like take something all the way back, right? So just kind of let your mind wander around, like how'd your oatmeal wind up on your plate? Well, that's really curious. Like how far back can you take it all the way back to the seed that was planted in the ground? Just letting that mind wander is really kind of a fun activity, and it also builds gratitude, right? If we think of it that way. And feel free to buy me a cup of coffee, that would be great. So connecting with others activates and reinforces the brain's relational circuitry. How many times today have you heard, it's connection, it's relationship, it's connection, it's relationship, it's being attached to an adult. It's all of these things. And so having intentional time around that. And remember, when we even talked about like the 5 love languages, one of the love languages is time with people. And so there's certain people that when we talk about enrichment, this component of enrichment is essential for them, right? As much as for some people, downtime, right? So the people who are more extroverted might appreciate more connection. Introverts might want the downtime, right? So all of these ways, and so thinking like, how can you create time for that downtime, the doodling, the mind wandering, and then how can you create connection, right? So maybe just doing like popcorn stories, like, and you guys know what that is? Like, I'm gonna give my version and see if it's the same. So like, in my way of a popcorn story is like, I start the story and I say, once upon a time, and then someone says, a big red truck drove over the Rocky Mountains, and then someone else. Is that your version of popcorn story too? Yeah? Yeah, okay. So like the whole group, we're connecting into creation of a beautiful story. Yeah. Maybe lunch groups, ways to get people to connect. It could be like a small mentorship. My youngest has a thing where the 5th graders go out and are on the playground with the 2nd graders, and they help them with like conflict, or they help kind of just be the older kids, the 5th graders. It makes me giggle that they're the mature ones, that are on the playground to help kind of the 2nd graders find their way through some of the obstacles of being a 2nd grader. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between time in and time out. So typically we think of time out as what? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Bad thing, right? You're in time out. As an adult, I welcome that. I'm like, yes, please put me in time out. That would be lovely. All day tomorrow, I'll call in sick. It's fine. Maybe next week I could be in time out too, right? But really, when we're a kid, timeouts are not a good thing, right? And so what timeout means is it's time apart. It's time that's withdrawn. It's disconnected. It feels like rejection. You're left on your own. It could be punitive and shameful. And it could be very ineffective, yeah? So I remove you from all of this, and maybe what you're really desperate for is connection. Okay, and so you're acting out. So student is acting out, student's misbehaving, and what they really want is connection. Now we've actually taken them further away from what their needs are. Their need to feel safe, their need to feel belonging, competence, purpose, like all of those things. Whereas when we look at having time in, we look at being together, giving attention to someone, feeling connected, feeling accepted, not being shameful, learning and how to be empowered and being effective, okay? So noticing the difference between what does it look like to be time in and time out being sort of not a cool thing, right? If you look at it from this perspective. So time in, quietly reflecting internally and focusing on sensation, emotion, thoughts, integrates the brain and grows strengths. Time in, I think, is a really great opportunity for us to look at what I refer to as our inner landscape, right? So we know our outer landscape, we're like engaged with it all the time. But again, self-awareness, self-regulation, emotional coping skills, planting the seed in the quiet, like all of those things come from some time around inner reflection, inner landscape. So what's happening internally? How are things happening? Do you have like tightness in your belly? How is your breath? All of those sort of things. So having some time in quiet reflection. So it could be journaling, body scans, gratitudes. In my family, at the end of the day, we always do high-low, which was what's the best part of your day and what was the worst part of your day. Started doing it when my older boys were teenagers, because if you sit around a dinner table with teenage boys, they don't talk. They don't talk for years, actually, teenage boys. I don't know if you know that about teenage boys. They can go years without talking, at least to their mother. But so we started doing high-low. So they were required to tell me the best thing that happened to them and then the thing that was the most challenging. And sometimes the challenges were pretty vulnerable and they were things they wanted to share, and sometimes not so much. Sometimes it was just like, well, you forgot to give me lunch money today, Mom, and so I didn't get low. Oh, great. Well, your low was because of me. Thanks. But then also we would do gratitude. So, but what are you grateful for today then? Like, you know, the kind of the bookends of your day, what was good, what wasn't so good. And then within there, a lot of other things happened. So that time in of just like reflecting what was good. And now we know from that, going back to that Duke research study, if we can say what part did we play in that. So I'm really grateful, to spend this day with you guys, right? And what part was mine? I got to stand up here, but I also got to interact with a really amazing group of teachers who are invested in their kids. They're invested in their professional development. Like, to me, that's really awesome. So I'm really grateful for that. All right, so physically moving and moving our brains, moving our bodies, like all of those things, and that mind-body connection. As someone whose background in education is exercise physiology, I can attest to 1,000% that the benefits to moving our body is endless. Like we could have talked all day simply on what happens physiologically when we move our body. And some of the most simplest of things is, we are better at self-regulating. We discharge some of the energy that may be accumulating in our bodies. There's a book called Spark, written by John Rady. And in the first chapter of that book, he looks at, and I want to say it's in Chicago, but it's been a while since I read the book. But he worked with a school, and they took a group of 7th graders who were underperforming in reading. And the only thing they changed about their curriculum, so they took these underperformers and they had them exercise for 60 minutes before the school day started, or that was their first period of the day, one of those. So for the first thing they did of the day, they did 60 minutes of exercise. They didn't change anything else, no more remedial reading, no extra tutoring, like nothing. all the reading scores came up to grade level with just, basically in short science terms, they oxygenated the brain, right? Opened up, it was vasodilation, it was all these things. So I'm not saying it's always that simple, but that is really a powerful way to look at how exercise can enhance and enrich a kid's life by just getting them to move their body. It makes them smarter. So I used to, when I taught at a university in Denver, I used to say to my students before we took tests, don't stay up till 3 a.m. studying and being sleep deprived. Get your normal 8 hours of sleep, study as much as you can, and then do 30 minutes of exercise before you come to class. And you'll probably get the same test score one way or the other, because sleep deprived and studied more is probably the equal to less study and more exercise. Okay, so movement, walk and talk, talks in nature, just being able to connect and any amount of movement. And sometimes when I get on this, people are like, oh, now you're gonna give us an exercise prescription. And any movement counts. Breathing and taking your arms up over your head, that's movement. That's getting the lymphatic fluid to move through the system. It's stimulating that nervous system. So it can be anything, even just the simplest of movements matter. And so don't think of this as, well, Paula, I'm not gonna run a marathon, so I guess I'm not gonna move. Anything matters, just moving that body, getting that lymphatic system engaged, increasing blood flow to the brain, all of those things matter. So it's about the movement, not the quantity or the quality. How many times have we talked about this today, right? And it's funny that I have to be the one to talk about it. It's just a subliminal message. So resting and sleeping, and I just said, the example I gave, sometimes it's better to get the solid 8 hours of sleep than to get the house cleaned, or to study more, or to write that paper, or to grade those. Sometimes we need to prioritize sleep over everything else, because it really is very systemic when we're sleep deprived. It is an essential survival thing that we get sleep. When they look at studies on pain and pain response, yeah, you're nodding your head because you probably know what I'm going to say. So if I have a broken elbow and I'm rested and well, and they say, how much does your elbow hurt? And I say, well, on a 1 to 10 scale, my elbow pain is a 2 out of 10. Oh, okay. If I come in the next day, but I didn't get a good night's sleep, my perception of my elbow pain is higher, only because I'm sleep deprived, right? So if we translate that into other aspects of our lives, how irritable are we? And I'll pick on Kristen here for a second, because we had a really good conversation on, I think it was Wednesday. And so, not to speak to you, but I'll try and tell the story the way you did. So Kristen traveled by airplane on Monday, a quick fly out an hour, go to a conference, fly back, and the same day, right? So this really long day of travel. Travel was hung up, she was late, everything was delayed. And she said, by the time I got back, I was like a 2-year-old. I was crying and I was cranky and everything was upsetting to me, right? And so we do that, our body's ability to be resilient and to thrive goes down, right, as our sleep goes down. Yeah, so having that good quality sleep, nothing could be more important. And when we think about kids who maybe are coming from households where their sleep is disrupted because it's not a stable household, or there's things happening in that household, I think it's even more important that we identify these kids as, they may need some enrichment. This may be their kind of enrichment. All right, so kind of the basics there. And then just being fun and play, right? So not to neglect that there's nothing wrong with just having a good time, having some extra recess. And I like to refer to a lot of the exercise that I do is just a grown-up recess, right? When we get to be grown-ups, we don't get recess anymore. Nobody's like, here's your 30-minute of recess after lunch, right? So you have to give it to yourself. You have to be like, here's my recess for the day, and I'm gonna integrate this into my life. It's part of that self-care strategy, right? And maybe it's mindfulness, maybe it's whatever, but it's to have that sense of play is really powerful. Okay, and there's just some good activities and examples. So, so how do you focus on the assets instead of their limitations would be a good question. How do you help youth identify growths and share their strengths? And what helps you enjoy life and express gratitude? So why don't we do a popcorn on that last question? So what do you do, or what helps you enjoy life and express gratitude? So whatever comes up for you, what is that?
I start the day off every morning by writing down 5 things that I'm grateful for.
That's fantastic. So writing down your gratitudes every day. Awesome. I love it. It's such a good practice. What else?
Dance party.
Dance party? Is that alone in your like kitchen by yourself or?
All are invited.
All are invited.
Or they join the dance.
Awesome. Okay. Who else? What else?
Noticing like things in nature, like when I'm walking across campus, like
Yeah.
to the beauty there.
Yeah, so being present and noticing the world around you. Mm-hmm.
I enjoy when I get to like pick up my kids like that, like when I'm the first one to see them, because sometimes I'll stay at work and then my husband picks them up and I don't see them until we get home, and it's a different experience than like right when they get out of school or something, and I enjoy that when I'm the one who gets to do that.
Yeah. So having that first point of touch with those kiddos. Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Anything else?
I try to, anytime I like go to the grocery store or anytime that I have to like speak with somebody who's working in retail or wherever I am, just to always make sure that I'm saying thank you and engaging, like, to at least ask how are you and saying thank you.
Yeah.
That is helpful in just remembering that life is fine.
Yeah. So just being kind when you're meeting people in and around. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, lots of ways that we can enjoy life and express gratitude. And there's something to be said too, I think, for expressing gratitude does not negate that nothing is perfect, right? I can have big problems in my life, and I can have things that are very challenging, and also have things I'm grateful. It's both and, not either or. And sometimes gratitude primes the pump for seeing those things as not yet, right? I can be really stuck and have gratitude and then be able to shift into, well, not yet, right? I don't know what's going to happen yet. Yeah, so sometimes gratitude's a primer to get other stuff to move. Yeah. All right, I think that,
Positive with like your thought process.
yeah.
It's hard to, you know, like I had strep throat, was feeling miserable, and then I'm like, I don't, you know, I'm fine. Like this is fine. This is just a little setback. I'll be fine. And to be
Yeah.
you know, I'll be fine. And I put myself, someone near and dear to me going through cancer, and I'm like, I don't know how they get through every day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to try to get a positive, turn things around so it's not so bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard to do.
It is hard. Yeah, that's true. It is hard to turn things around and to not get sort of woe is me. And again, I think that's both and, right? Because sometimes like having strep and missing a meeting or not being able to parent and those things are really awful.
Could be worse.
And it could be worse, but it's also your real life in that moment too,
Yeah.
right? And so it's kind of like saying, yeah, things could be worse. And it is tough right now. Yeah.
Or someone says, how are you today? Okay. Actually, I'm really good. Thanks for asking.
Right.
You know, like,
I'm fantastic.
yeah. Like,
Yeah.
Kind of switching that whole, I think you get going so fast. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
I'm really good. Things are
Yeah.
fine. Things are good. You
Yeah.
know, it's just trying to
Yeah.
twist it just like,
Yeah. I think we're pretty fortunate if we can
yeah.
find stuff to be grateful for and enjoy our lives. It's pretty lucky. So, all right, I'm going to let Molly finish it. So thank you guys.